required to be volunteering.
Right.
I'll figure it out.
Yeah, I'm sure you will. There's definitely a section on background checks specifically, so that might be a good time to bring that
We have
up.
a whole webinar on background checks.
Oh,
checks
good,
that was
good.
done about a year ago.
Well, I can do a plug for that.
Yeah.
If y'all will do that again sometime.
Well, it's up on our website.
Oh,
So
that's the
all of
cool thing about
webcasts
this,
are on
huh?
our website. But what happened is because a lot of people realize this goes up on our website the next day.
That's perfect.
A lot of people watch at night as
Sure.
opposed to
During
right
the
now.
day.
But we have a really
Welcome to the monthly webcast presented by Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. We want to begin by thanking Georgia Legal Services for hosting this webcast and making it available on its website. The information provided during this webcast does not constitute specific legal advice and is for informational purposes only. My name is Rebecca Shanlever. I am a labor and employment lawyer with Troutman Sanders Law Firm. I'll be talking today about some of the legal issues that come up when an organization is working with volunteers. I'd like to encourage everyone participating today to submit questions that you have, to share examples of situations that you've encountered working with volunteers. I'll be able to receive those questions and try to answer them, and also share those experiences with the rest of the group. So I'd love to hear from those of you who are participating. We'd like this to be a collaborative effort. Volunteers are important, of course, for any nonprofit organization. Volunteers can do anything from caring to children, working with the homeless, doing manual labor, and volunteers are very, very important. When volunteers work with an organization, however, there are some legal issues that can arise, and I'm sure that all of you have had situations where this has come up. What we're going to do today is talk about first of all, some of the legal issues that can come up when you're working with volunteers. In other words, what can go wrong? And then we're going to talk about some of the laws that actually apply and cover when you're working with volunteers. And then, most importantly, we're going to talk about what an organization can do to prevent things from going wrong. This last section is, of course, the most important because it focuses on prevention. Some of the things we're going to talk about today are situations that have already happened, but what we want to do going forward, and the purpose of this webinar, is to prevent things from going wrong. Of course, the legal issues and the law will change over time, so remember, whenever you have any specific issue related to working with a volunteer, it's best to seek legal advice about that specific situation. So let's start by talking about what can go wrong when you're working with volunteers. First is your volunteers can suffer injuries themselves. You can experience a problem with injuries to your volunteers. Even with the best planning and the best prevention, accidents can happen that result in injuries to volunteers. It can be a physical injury, especially when physical activity is part of the process. It can also be other types of injuries, emotional distress, or those types of injuries, non-physical injuries. I'm an employment lawyer, so I deal a lot with claims of discrimination, harassment, and those types of non-physical injuries to employees. Those same types of injuries can occur when you're working with volunteers. An organization is responsible for providing a safe and harassment-free workplace, not only for its employees, but also for its volunteers. An organization may also be required to provide an accommodation for any volunteers that have physical disabilities. Has anybody ever had a situation where they've had to fire a volunteer? It sounds like an employer firing a volunteer, and really what you're doing is asking a volunteer not to work with the organization anymore. That's a situation that can happen when you're dealing with injuries to volunteers, and we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Another category of injuries that can happen and things that can go wrong is injuries caused by your volunteers. Volunteers normally have good intentions, but sometimes they still have the potential to injure the clients that your organization works with and also your employees. These can include harassment, like we talked about earlier. They can include actual physical injuries as well. Sometimes an organization can be responsible for these types of injuries caused by the volunteer, even if the volunteer is not your employee. One example of a situation where a volunteer has caused an injury to an organization's clients that I've dealt with in the past was an organization that had a job shadow program. What happened in this situation was that the organization solicited volunteers from the community for school-aged children to shadow the volunteer in his or her job and learn a little bit more about that person's job. It was a career opportunity-focused program. One of the volunteers it was a male volunteer, and he was assigned to work with or have a young female student job shadow him in his workplace. The organization matched up the volunteers with the children who were interested in the job shadowing. This particular student reported when she got back to her school that the volunteer who she was job shadowing with, had made some sexually inappropriate comments to her. Of course, the school reported this back to the organization, and the organization then called me to find out what they needed to do and what the potential risks and issues were. We'll talk in a minute about some things that you can do to prevent situations like these. And luckily in this instance, this organization had done a lot of these things. And it became an issue of what then we needed to do to investigate and also to make sure that that individual who had volunteered was no longer allowed to participate in the job shadow program or anything else that the organization did with children. But it is a good example of a real-life situation where your volunteers, who presumably have good intentions, may end up causing some kind of injury, not only to the client in that situation, but potentially to the organization itself. Let's talk now about a hypothetical. I'm going to read to you a little example. It's a situation of everything that could go wrong went wrong, and we'll see if anybody in the audience has any questions about it or sees any issues that potentially are a problem in the situation. Here's our hypothetical. Sally is a staff member of a nonprofit organization called Green Atlanta, whose mission is to help our city move up on the Green Cities Index. Currently, we're 32 out of 43 major cities in the United States. Vince is a volunteer for Green Atlanta. During a Saturday workday sponsored by Green Atlanta, the group runs out of supplies, and Sally and Vince are asked to drive to a hardware store to pick up more. Vince, the volunteer, drives them both in a hybrid vehicle owned by Green Atlanta. On the way, Vince tells Sally that he jammed his thumb trying to drive stakes into the ground to hold up trees that they were planting. Sally asks why he didn't use a rubber mallet or some kind of other tool, and Vince, the volunteer, confesses that his group didn't have any tools at all, just the stakes and the trees. Sally admits that Green Atlanta needs to do a better job of getting volunteers the right supplies. Sally then asks Vince about a rumor that he is dating Sharon, one of Sally's Green Atlanta co-workers. Vince admits that they're seeing each other and says Sharon kind of pressured him into dating after he started volunteering. Sally tells Vince that it is not appropriate for employees to date volunteers, But Vince says no one told him that he shouldn't get romantically involved with anyone at the organization. In fact, no one told him much of anything at all when he started to volunteer. Vince, remember now he's driving, goes on to confess that Green Atlanta didn't even ask if he had a driver's license. Sally, now very worried, asks, "You do have a license, don't you?" Vince says, "I did, but it got revoked. Too many parking tickets. But a few parking tickets are nothing to a convicted felon like me." Vince takes his hand off the wheel to put convicted felon in air quotes and slams into the back of another car. Vince is now as upset as Sally, but instead of worrying about whether he's hurt anyone else in the accident, he's concerned that Green Atlanta won't let him volunteer anymore and that he won't get the bonus they've been paying him for helping out on Saturdays. I expect that most of you can see some of the potential concerns that arise in this hypothetical. One of the first ones is the relationship between Vince, who is a volunteer, and Sharon, an employee at the organization. There are lots of potential legal issues that could arise out of that situation, and there are things that the organization, that Green Atlanta, could have done to prevent that situation. We'll talk about those shortly. Another obvious issue here is the driving of the vehicle by Vince, who's a volunteer. Some people may ask, does that mean a volunteer can never drive a vehicle owned by the organization? The answer is no, that's not what it means. But there are some very basic steps that an organization can take just to make sure that it is okay for a volunteer to drive. And it doesn't necessarily require anything extensive. The organization could have at least asked Vince about his driver's license. There are some other potential issues here that may not necessarily be legal ones, but a little bit of prevention and planning by Green Atlanta could have avoided them. What about the situation with Vince injuring himself, jamming his thumb, planting trees? If there had been the right tools for the job and his group had been provided the equipment they needed, Vince might not have hurt himself. Now that pales in comparison with any potential injuries that arise from another problem in this situation, and that is the car accident. It doesn't seem like Vince or Sally are hurt, but we don't know anything about the other drivers in the car. So that's our hypothetical. We're going to move on now. We see from this hypothetical some things that could go wrong. So let's talk for a minute now about some of the laws that govern organizations in the workplace and that might apply to this hypothetical. And then when we finish that, we can talk more about prevention and what could have been done to prevent the situations in this hypothetical. I think we have a question from someone in the group.
Okay. Is a volunteer an agent of an organization in carrying out our regularly scheduled volunteer activities?
The question is a volunteer an agent of the organization in carrying out the regularly scheduled activities of the organization? And the answer is it very much depends, but certainly a volunteer can be considered an agent of the organization, particularly in a situation like this where the volunteer is driving the organization's vehicle. When a volunteer holds him or herself out as having the authority to bind the organization, then he or she can be the agent of the organization. What does it mean to hold yourself out as an agent of the organization? If a volunteer is driving a company vehicle, an organization-owned vehicle, that's one factor that could be considered holding himself out as an agent of the organization. If a volunteer has access to funds of the organization or is authorized to make deposits or sign checks on behalf of the organization, that's another fact that might indicate the volunteer has the authority to act on behalf of the organization. There are lots of other facts that could go into that analysis. Those are some examples. But to answer the question, yes, there are some situations where a volunteer can be considered the organization's agent. Another question.
In reference to your example, should regularly scheduled volunteers receive the same health and safety orientation as a prerequisite to service?
Should volunteers receive the same regularly scheduled orientation that I assume that employees of the organization receive? That is certainly one way that you can prevent situations like what happened here with Vince from happening in your organization. Vince is a regular volunteer, it sounds like, from the facts of this scenario. It's not someone who showed up for a one-day work day. He's driving the organization's vehicle. When a volunteer is a repeat volunteer and regularly working with the organization, it certainly does make sense and would be a prudent course of action to have that volunteer go through very similar training that your employees go through. We will talk in a minute about the difference between employees and volunteers, and that is an important distinction. You might consider having volunteer training separate and apart from employee training, but it can contain some of the same content. It's important to remember that for different volunteers volunteer in different ways, and for someone who is coming to do a single workday type event, that person may not require a lot of detailed orientation like your organization's employees. But for someone who's volunteering on a repeat basis and regularly working with the organization, he or she absolutely should receive some kind of orientation and training that will cover situations like what Vince is saying he didn't get. He didn't know he wasn't supposed to have a relationship with someone who worked with the organization. He didn't know anything at all, really. He didn't receive any kind of training. So that is a good question, and the answer is absolutely. There's nothing wrong with having, and it's a good idea to have volunteers go through orientation. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to how we can prevent these types of situations. So what laws apply when you are working with volunteers? There is a Volunteer Protection Act that actually provides protection not for the organization, but for the volunteers of a 501c3 organization. Basically, the law states that a volunteer can't be responsible for acts that happen within the scope of his or her authority as a volunteer. There are some exceptions, of course, like with most laws, and they apply when the volunteer is stepping outside his or her responsibilities as a volunteer. So there is a law out there that does provide some protections for your volunteers. In addition, in Georgia, there is charitable immunity for charitable organizations, which most 501c3 organizations will fall under. What this doctrine says is that an organization isn't liable for its officers' or employees' negligence unless the organization is not exercising ordinary care. That's generally the case also for volunteers, even volunteers who, like the question asked a moment ago, are considered agents of the organization. So unless the organization isn't exercising reasonable care, then under charitable immunity doctrine, the organization's not going to be responsible for any injuries caused by his or her employees or volunteers. Now, what's ordinary care or what's reasonable care? What that means is, did the organization know, or should the organization have known, that something the volunteer was doing could injure others, and then fail to take action? Now, the hypothetical that we talked about provides a good example of this. Did the organization know that Vince didn't have a driver's license? We don't have any facts to suggest that they knew that he didn't have a driver's license. But should the organization have known that Vince didn't have a driver's license? And that's where these legal issues become kind of a gray area. Was it the organization's responsibility, before allowing Vince to drive a vehicle owned by the organization, to find out, at a minimum, if Vince had a driver's license. In a lot of situations, that would be found to be ordinary care or reasonable care, would be to at least ask Vince for a copy of his driver's license. Another legal application for volunteers is something called the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is a federal law that governs background checks and credit checks on volunteers. This is only going to come into play if you're running a credit check on volunteers, and we'll talk in a few moments about when that might be an appropriate thing to do. A credit check is a specific check, not necessarily a criminal background check, but a check into the history about an employee, about a volunteer's financial history and credit status. We'll talk again in a moment about when that might be a good idea to do it, but just so everyone knows, the Fair Credit Reporting Act applies when you do a credit check on a volunteer. It doesn't prohibit those kinds of credit checks, but it does say that if you do one, you have to give the individual certain notices ahead of time. The idea is that a credit agency can be wrong about a volunteer's credit history, and if you give notice to the volunteer, then if the credit check that comes back is inaccurate, has other errors in it, then the volunteer can provide the organization with updated information that's actually correct. So that's another law that can come into play. One more law that can apply when you're working with volunteers is something called the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is the federal law that requires companies to pay minimum wage and overtime to their employees. A lot of people may ask, why would a law that applies to employees cover an organization that is working with volunteers? Well, the way it can come up is if a volunteer is blurring the line between being a true volunteer and an actual employee. This law that I'm talking about, the Fair Labor Standards Act, defines what a volunteer is. If someone is a volunteer, then the act doesn't apply. But to be truly a volunteer, the volunteer has to provide entirely voluntary services. The work that the volunteer does has to benefit the agency or the organization more than the volunteer. A volunteer isn't replacing an employee. A volunteer has no expectation of getting any compensation. The volunteer provides services during non-working hours, and the volunteer's duties are inconsequential and different from the duties of the organization's employees. This is a long list of factors, and no one factor is going to turn a volunteer into an employee, but those are the facts that the law looks at in considering whether someone is an employee. How did this come up in our issue, in our hypothetical? Vince mentioned something about not getting paid a bonus that he had been receiving for volunteering on Saturdays. Paying a volunteer is something that is the quickest way to turn a volunteer into an employee. And we'll talk later about how you can prevent this, but that's something to be on the lookout for. This is actually come up several times for me. I've advised several organizations on this issue, and I've even had one be sued by a volunteer who was claiming that he or she was actually an employee. I've got a question.
You mentioned not paying volunteers anything, but what about giving them gift cards to a local store as a thank you?
We have a question about obviously not paying a volunteer money is something that is important, but what about giving a volunteer a gift card, either to a local store or maybe a gas card to help with commuting expenses? This is a really good question. The IRS has taken the position that gift cards are, in fact, the same as money. So when you are giving a gift card to a volunteer, that potentially looks like you're giving them cash, and it looks like you're paying the volunteer and can potentially turn the volunteer into an employee. There are ways that you can assist your volunteers with their expenses. One thing you might consider doing rather than giving them a gift card is reimbursing them for actual expenses. Let's say they're incurring gas expenses, commuting back and forth. Have them present receipts, and then you can, or present mileage requests, and you can reimburse them for the actual cost. If the volunteer is purchasing supplies, have them bring in receipts and reimburse them that way. Don't just give them a gift card to Staples to go pick up supplies. Another question.
Is it okay to not pay an employee for hours helping at a one-time weekend fundraiser event if the employee does it voluntarily?
This question is it okay to not pay an employee of the organization for time spent at a weekend fundraising event or other truly volunteer event if the employee is actually volunteering? This question comes up a lot, and it's a good question. Many organizations do require their employees to volunteer for the organization. If the work the employee is doing outside of his or her regular hours is truly volunteer work, that is okay. The question becomes, is it really outside of his or her regular work? If it's a one-time or occasional fundraising type event that's described in this question, that's probably going to be okay. The key is when the person is volunteering, is he or she doing the same duties that she does when she's actually on the clock working and getting paid by the employer? And if the answer is yes, let's give another example. The employee's regular duties include answering the phone from 9 to 5 during regular business hours during the week. And the organization is also open for a half a day on Saturdays, and the organization asks the employee to come in on Saturday mornings on a volunteer basis to answer phones from 9 to 12. That is a much tougher situation because the individual is doing the same things that she does during the week on the weekend, which is the supposedly volunteer time. The hypothetical that the questioner asked is a good example, though, of a situation where the employee is doing something different than what she normally does during her working hours. Another question.
What are non-working hours for volunteers?
What are non-working hours for volunteers? I think if I understand this question correctly, it is if an employee works regular hours, what would be considered non-working hours. And again, it very much depends on the situation. If an employee works and gets paid, they're presumably going to have some kind of regular schedule of working hours, and those are the hours that are tracked and the employee is paid minimum wage for, and if he or she works over 40 hours in a week is paid overtime for. Anything separate and apart from the employee's job duties could be potentially considered volunteer work if it's truly on a volunteer basis. It's not as much the actual schedule of the working hours or non-working hours. It more focuses on what the employee's actual job duties are. This is one example of a situation where it might be helpful to have a job description for your employees so that it's clear in writing what the actual working duties are that the employee is getting paid for, so that anything outside of those written job duties that are done on a volunteer basis are clearly volunteer work. Another question.
What if the employee has the understanding that this volunteer job, which may be different duties, but is basically expected if they want to keep their job? What if that's the situation?
The question is, what if the employee has the understanding from the organization that volunteer work by the employee is really a requirement of the job, that it's not going to be paid, but it is really a requirement if the employee wants to work with the organization. It's not at all uncommon that an organization would require not only employees, but board members, other volunteers to do volunteer work for the organization. When an organization is requiring paid employees to volunteer, it is a good idea to have those understandings in writing so that there is no question down the road if an employee raises the issue that he or she, for example, should be paid for those hours the employee spends volunteering. It can be as simple as an email that is printed out and signed by the employee, or a short memo that explains what the employee's job duties are and what the employee will be paid for, and then that the employee is expected to volunteer, and that those duties are different, and that the employee will not be paid for those. The best practice is not to truly require any actual paid employees to volunteer, although many employees want to volunteer, and many organizations want their employees to volunteer, and employees are a great resource for finding volunteers. So the best way to deal with those situations is to make sure that any understandings are put in writing so that there are no issues down the road. And we have seen this situation come up. I recently defended an organization in a lawsuit that was brought by an employee who was supposedly taking work home at night and volunteering hours on the weekends, and the employee ended up having some other issues and was let go from the organization, and she sued the organization claiming back pay for the unpaid hours that she spent working off the clock, and we were able to get the case dismissed, and she dropped the case partly because we had some clear understandings and communications to the employee about not working off the clock and not working from home, and about the volunteer work being truly volunteer. So those are all good questions. I think we have another one.
Our organization relies on volunteers to provide some important roles that we would otherwise need to hire for. Please explain further your comments on what is meant by must not be replacing an employee.
The question is, when an organization relies heavily on volunteers for work and duties that need to be done that the organization might otherwise pay employees to perform, and to explain a little bit more about the volunteer not replacing an employee. The requirement that the courts look at in determining whether someone is truly a volunteer, one of the factors they consider, and again, this is only one, is that a volunteer is not replacing an employee. So what does that mean? A little bit more detail about that. If an organization has a paid employee who is, let's give our example of answering the telephones again, and then and has had a practice of paying an employee for answering the telephone, and then due to budget restraints or many other issues that can come up with nonprofit organizations, cuts back on that employee's hours and reduces that receptionist or person who's answering the phone from a 40-hour a week to, say, part-time 20-hour a week employee, and then recruits a volunteer to do the same thing that employee does the other 20 hours of the week. That would be a situation where potentially a volunteer is then replacing an employee or replacing the duties that the employee would do. When an organization has always had, let's give the opposite example, where an organization has always had a volunteer answer telephones and has never paid an employee to do that particular function, then that's not going to be a factor that will be looked at where a volunteer is replacing an employee, because you've never had an employee performing those duties. So that is a couple of examples that I hope help explain that particular factor a little more. All right, we're going to finish the rest of our now that we've talked about some of the laws that can come up and apply in and when you're working with volunteers. We're going to go back to our hypothetical for a minute and see what laws have come into play in our hypothetical. Green Atlanta, the organization, fires Vince from his volunteer position and announces in the newspaper that everything was his fault. Vince sues Green Atlanta for intentional infliction of emotional distress, both because he was fired and for injuries from the crash. He also sues for defamation based on the statement in the newspaper, and he brings claims for pain and suffering from his jammed thumb from planting trees without proper tools, and for sexual harassment based on being pressured to date Sharon, the Green Atlanta employee. Finally, he sues for unpaid wages, arguing that the bonuses he got for those Saturday hours meant he was actually an employee and he didn't get paid for all the hours that he put in volunteering for the organization. But Vince's isn't the only lawsuit against Green Atlanta. 2 people were in the other car that was involved in the accident with Vince, and they sue the organization. Remember, it was a Green Atlanta vehicle that Vince was driving. They argue that the organization was negligent in letting Vince drive the car because the organization didn't do any kind of background check, even just to see if he had a driver's license. When those folks' lawyers find out that Vince had been receiving bonuses from Green Atlanta, they then argue that Vince was actually an employee of the organization. That matters because if Vince is an employee, there's a greater possibility of liability for the organization. Remember when I said that everything that could go wrong in this hypothetical went wrong? That's exactly what has happened. We have not only the wage hour issues that we talked about with a volunteer being turned into an employee. That claim has been raised by Vince. He also is claiming physical injury for not only the pain and suffering from the jammed thumb, but also from sexual harassment. He's also claimed for the emotional injuries arising from sexual harassment. And he's also suing the organization for making defamatory statements about him in the newspaper. And it's not only Vince that has sued us, it's also the individuals involved in the accident. Even if Green Atlanta can defend itself against these allegations, it's dealing with 2 lawsuits. It's dealing with bad press in the paper, and the cost of defending these 2 separate lawsuits is a huge cost to the organization, even if it wins. So that's the end of our hypothetical. And does anybody have any questions at this moment about the hypothetical? I'd love to hear from you about that before we move on to the prevention section and what we might be able to do to prevent these things from going wrong. All right, we'll go ahead and talk about prevention, and please do ask questions as they arise. I really appreciate the good questions that we've had so far. We got one. Great.
Would it make a difference if Vince was driving his own vehicle?
That's a very good question. Would it make a difference if Vince was driving his own vehicle? It might. The argument would still be that the organization had failed to provide reasonable care to prevent injuries to others. And if Vince was on an errand for the organization, which if we remember back from the beginning of the hypothetical, he was on his way to pick up supplies for the workday project that they were doing, then potentially that could be within the scope of his activities for the organization. Remember though that even though Vince was driving his own car, remember though that we talked a minute ago about the charitable immunity doctrine and also the protection for volunteers themselves. When a volunteer is working within the scope of his volunteer activities, then the organization is protected from any kind of liability, and the volunteer is also protected. So as long as Vince was within the scope of his volunteer work, which it sounds from these facts like he was, there's a good argument then that the organization and Vince himself are protected. The issue would become, of course, did the organization know, or should they have known, that there was a problem with Vince driving, even if it was driving his own car. Another issue that will come up with cars, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is insurance. And there is, of course, insurance doesn't mean that the organization is not liable, but it does mean that there may be insurance available to pay any claims. And if Vince is driving his own car, assuming he has insurance, which we don't know from this hypothetical, then the insurance would be available to pay for any claims brought against the organization. One thing that organizations can do to prevent injuries, prevent things from going wrong, like what happened in this hypothetical, is to provide volunteers with a safe place to volunteer. This first focuses on the actual place that volunteers are providing their services, but it can also mean the tools and the circumstances and the surroundings of whatever the volunteer activity is. In our hypothetical, there are some safe volunteering issues that came up. The group that Vince was working with didn't even have any kind of tools for their project. All they had were the trees and the stakes that they needed to put the trees in the ground. And by not providing the proper tools, the organization potentially didn't provide a safe volunteer place for their volunteers. So it's not only the physical location of the organization that needs to be maintained as a safe location, but also the circumstances and surroundings of any volunteer activities that need to be maintained as safe. So what can you do? Provide a checklist of potential hazards to look for, and have a volunteer or an employee of the organization go and check out any off-site locations ahead of time and make sure that they are safe. Whenever you have volunteers at your organization where any employees work, regular checks to make sure that the building is safe is a good idea. Having first aid supplies handy, whether that be at the location or at an off-site volunteer space, is also another way to prevent injuries to your volunteers. Another way that organizations can prevent injuries and protect themselves is to require applications for potential volunteers. Now, application sounds like a job application and something that you might do for an employee, but it's also a good way to protect yourself when you're working with volunteers. This is something that might be done when you have a repeat volunteer, like we talked about earlier. If you have someone who's wanting to work with your organization on a regular basis, getting an application filled out and getting information from the employee is a great way to start with your responsibility to exercise reasonable care. Not just for liability purposes, to find out what that individual's background is and find out the names of references that might be contacted, but also to get information about your volunteer and his or her interests, and be able to place them in the right volunteer work or volunteer position that will fit with their experience and their interests. Question?
If an organization is constantly trying to get volunteers, wouldn't this whole process discourage volunteers from participating?
If an organization is constantly recruiting and trying to find new volunteers, does requiring an application discourage folks from volunteering with the organization? In some instances, it may discourage people. And although I have found, and I know when I volunteer for an organization, I don't mind sharing my interests, and I like for the organization to know what I'm interested in. If an individual is wanting to work with your organization on a repeat basis and expresses concern about filling out an application or providing references, I would see that as actually as a red flag for that individual working with your organization. This isn't to suggest that every person who volunteers needs to fill out an application. If someone is showing up for a one-time service project or a fundraising event that's a single day or specified time period, then an application probably doesn't make sense. But when you're talking about a repeat volunteer, a regular volunteer who's going to be providing services over time, an application probably does make sense. And again, if someone doesn't want to fill out an application or provide you with background information, then you might need to think about whether that individual is a good fit for your organization. A similar way that you can prevent injuries and protect your organization is to actually screen your volunteers. Not just get the application information, but also follow up on the information that's provided. Actually go and check the references that are provided by a volunteer. In the situation the example that I gave earlier about the job shadow program, where the volunteer had made inappropriate comments to a client of the organization, what we found out later was that this particular individual had some harassment-related issues in the workplace. That if we had called and checked references on this particular individual's employer and with his supervisor beforehand, we might have been able to find out about before we went forward with allowing him to participate in the job shadow program. And this hypothetical is a good example of the heightened responsibility that an organization has when it is working with children and allowing volunteers to work directly with children. Screening volunteers may not be a requirement for all types of volunteer activity, but particularly where a volunteer is working with a vulnerable population, is going to have any kind of interaction with anyone underage, with minors, it's a particularly good idea to go ahead and do some screening. What the organization that was a client of mine in my hypothetical in the job shadow program did going forward was to they were already getting applications from volunteers for the job shadow program, but what they decided to do going forward was to contact the individual's employer directly and speak with the individual volunteer's manager or supervisor and ask that manager or supervisor specifically, do you think that this employee would be a good volunteer for our program, the job shadow program involving working with middle school children? And that was a proactive step that they took going forward before allowing anyone to participate as a volunteer in the job shadow program. Question?
Is there a time that the law requires you to run a background check on a volunteer?
Is there ever a legal requirement that you must run a background check on a volunteer? Certainly in some situations, again, where a volunteer is working with vulnerable population, particularly children, the law is probably going to require that a background check or other screening be done on an individual. That there, in Georgia at least, unless you are a healthcare provider or teacher or other mandatory reporter of child abuse, there's not any specific law or statute that says a background check must be run. But as we talked about earlier, an organization's responsibility is to exercise reasonable care, ordinary care, and there are situations out there where courts have said that when a volunteer is going to be working with children, it is, as a matter of law, ordinary care or reasonable care to run a background check on an individual. We're not talking necessarily about situations where a volunteer is working in a group with employees of the organization or other volunteers and a group of children, but in a situation where, for example, a volunteer is going to be alone with a child for any length of time, have an overnight responsibility, or drive in a vehicle, be alone with a child for any length of time, then most likely failure to do a background check could result in liability for the organization if something were to go wrong. It's a good question. Another proactive measure that many organizations take is providing written rules or standards of conduct. The question earlier about having orientation like you have for your employees for volunteers was a good one. This is another good example of what an organization can do short of a full-on employee type orientation. Having written standards and rules that volunteers are required to abide by, that volunteers have to sign off on, is another way to do that type of training or orientation without a full interactive session like what we're doing today. There's nothing wrong with having a volunteer review rules of conduct and sign off on them and keeping a copy of them in the file. The question was asked earlier about an individual who maybe doesn't want to fill out an application. Same thing could happen here where a volunteer doesn't want to sign off on the rules of conduct or the written standards of the organization. Again, that might be a red flag of someone that you don't want to be working with your organization. This protects the organization by, for example, in our hypothetical, if Vince has sued the organization and said, I was sexually harassed by this employee of the organization, she forced me into this relationship with her. If there had been written standards of conduct that Vince was required to sign off on, that included a rule prohibiting volunteer-employee relationships and providing some method for volunteers to report any concerns in that area, then it would be harder for Vince to say, I didn't know that I couldn't be forced to have this relationship with an employee of the organization. And the organization would have a written document that shows Vince was aware of these rules and signed off on them. Written documents and rules of conduct are one way to train your volunteers, and another one that we've talked about is having training and orientation for your volunteers. I know I've volunteered for different organizations at times and showed up to provide services and had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. And apart from not making it a pleasant experience for that day that I'd signed up for, it made me less likely to volunteer and work with the organization again. The times that I've felt really good about my volunteer work and wanted to go back and work for an organization again have included instances where I was given detailed instructions on what was expected of me and where I could go if I had questions. And I expect that experience isn't unusual. Again, it's not just for preventing liability. Providing training and orientation and letting your volunteers know what you expect of them is something that can encourage repeat volunteers to come back to your organization again, not only to protect you. I think we have a question.
What would you recommend as critical elements of the volunteer orientation?
Wow, what would you recommend as critical elements for a volunteer training or orientation? There are actually some written examples of trainings and orientations for volunteers. Some of the that are available and that you can receive offline, and certainly feel free to contact Pro Bono Partnership for some examples of those. Some specific elements that would be important for any volunteer orientation would include a statement about the organization's commitment to equal opportunity for all volunteers, that if a volunteer needs any kind of accommodation to do his or her volunteer work, that the organization will do what it can to provide that. For example, a volunteer who may have a disability. It's important to include some orientation on, particularly if the organization is involved in working with children, any rules and regulations that relate to working with children would need to be included, particularly with the area of cars and trucks, other vehicles. to include an orientation on that, even if the rule is that that no volunteer is allowed to drive an organization-owned vehicle, then that should be part of the orientation. And those are just some examples, but again, there are some more detailed examples of orientation and training that we can make available to you later. Another question?
In reference to roles and responsibilities, is it advisable to use volunteers in filing HR files or medical records?
Say that one more time.
Sorry. Is it advisable to use volunteers in filing HR files or medical records?
Is it advisable to use volunteers in filing HR files or medical files? There's nothing that would necessarily prohibit a volunteer, an organization from having volunteers work with HR files or medical files. As part of any, before any volunteer is given that responsibility, though, it will be important to make sure that that volunteer understands the confidential nature of the information in those files and signs, wouldn't necessarily have to sign, but I would recommend that the volunteer sign some kind of memo or note indicating that he or she understands the confidential information and the confidential nature of the information and agrees not to disclose that information, particularly, Social Security numbers, names of minor children that might be contained in HR files. So nothing would prohibit that, but it would be important to take steps to make sure that that volunteer understands and agrees to the confidential nature of that information. Another preventive tool that a lot of organizations have been successful in using is to continue, not only on the front end, train and get information about volunteers, but to continue supervising volunteers throughout their volunteer time with the organization. The volunteer relationship doesn't end when someone goes through the screening process and starts providing services to the organization. It's important to continue to supervise and monitor what your volunteers are doing. Not only do you need to supervise them and give feedback as necessary so that the volunteer can learn and even become an even better volunteer, but don't be afraid to end the volunteer relationship if that becomes necessary to avoid risk to the organization. Just because a volunteer is unpaid doesn't mean that you can't ask the volunteer to stop providing services to the organization. Although, whenever you are considering a step like this, you need to make sure you investigate first, just like you would if you were going to be terminating an employee. You might even consider getting a third party, an outside opinion on when you're considering ending a volunteer relationship. This will be an unusual circumstance, but it has happened, and with the example I gave with the job shadow program, that was a very good example of when a job shadow volunteer was making inappropriate comments to a middle school girl. That was the end of that relationship. Another thing that many organizations do is to use waivers for volunteers. What a waiver or a release document is a document that an individual signs giving up his or her rights to make a claim against the organization. For-profit organizations use these all the time. If you've ever been a member of a gym or participated in a softball game or company picnic type event for your employer, you have probably signed a release or a waiver. And in Georgia, these documents are enforceable, and they provide protection to the organization for any injuries arising out of the volunteer relationship. Again, you may have a volunteer who doesn't want to sign a waiver. That happens a lot even in the for-profit context. Employees don't want to sign waivers when they're required to. And you need to, again, consider whether someone who doesn't want to sign a release is someone that you want volunteering for your organization. we do, as with the orientation and training, can provide examples of waiver forms that can be used for volunteers. We've talked a lot today about the special danger that vehicles can pose to an organization. For those of you who do have cars and trucks that are owned by your organization, we've seen from the hypothetical today how the vehicles can pose a special danger to not only volunteers but also to clients of the organization and also to third parties out there in another vehicle that don't have any relationship with your organization. How do you protect yourself? The best way to do that is to purchase insurance, which of course you have to have if you have a company-owned vehicle. Again, insurance doesn't protect you from being sued, but it does provide some coverage for any damages claims that may be brought when a car or truck is caused an injury to someone and a claim has been made against your organization. Another area where this can be a difficult situation, even when the organization doesn't own any vehicles, is any kind of special fundraising or other events where alcohol is served. There are many nonprofits out there who have special fundraising events or other activities where alcohol may be served. And just like any for-profit organization, if there is going to be alcohol served at an event, then there could be a claim against the organization for over-serving someone who then drives a vehicle and gets involved in an accident. So I appreciate everyone's time today. I hope that we can learn from these hypotheticals and the good questions that were asked and focus on prevention of these types of situations. Thanks again for the good questions, and we appreciate your time today. We appreciate Georgia Legal Services for making this webinar available. Thank you.